I would like to welcome author Linda Mary Wagner to discuss her latest book and her vision for a greener future. Linda's book, Rearview Reflections on Radical Change, A Green Grandma's Memoir and Call for Climate Action, is due out on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2024. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Could you tell us, Linda, a little bit about yourself and your background as an author and a former NPR journalist?
Sure. I would say one of the things that got me started in writing to begin with was back when I was a freshman in high school, I wrote a piece about freedom. It was an essay, and my mother loved it. And it was about the difference between the way kids and adults look at the concept of freedom. And that got me started, that I really loved writing. Beyond that, I would say the, my college years were really spent in philosophy and in creative writing as a minor. And so thinking and writing were a major part of my life in my college years. When I finished, I went on a trip around the country and really noticed what was going on with changes in the weather patterns in the country. And that was something that, made me think a lot about, what did I want to devote my time to in my work life? And I decided during the course of my trip around the country that I wanted to be a writer. That was what I wanted to do professionally. When I finished, I ended up volunteering at a public radio station in Buffalo, New York, WBFO, right around the same time that NPR was launching. And that was how I got involved with NPR. I started working for WBFO. I had a program there, and I began freelancing for the network. And once I left Buffalo, New York, I moved to Chicago. At that time, NPR was opening their Chicago bureau, and they were beginning the program Morning Edition. And they were very hungry for material from freelancers like me. So I spent my time working full-time as a freelance journalist for NPR and branched out to other media as well.
That's incredible. I'm going to go ahead. All right, Linda, and what inspired you to write your upcoming book, Rearview Reflections on Radical Change?
Like many people, this was partly a COVID project. In the course of looking at what my risks were as a 65-plus-year-old person who could get COVID, I did prepare living will documents for our children. And I began thinking about all the stuff that we had in our house that they might not want to deal with. And that included files and files of things that I had written over the course of 50 plus years. So I wanted to pare that down, and I wanted to also make use of it because I had many pieces that I had written that weren't published. I had a few that were published as poems or that were published as letters to editors. But I wanted to somehow make use of this without just tossing it in the garbage or shredding all of it or having a bonfire. So I put that together, and I spent really the year of 2021. I spent writing and choosing, looking at those pieces carefully, also in a few places changing a little bit of the language so that it would make more sense today. And then in 2022, I went through editing, got to the point where I had learned that, how many words you have, obviously relates to how many pages, and that it would be more realistic to have something that was around 60,000 words. And I cut pretty precipitously about 20,000 words out of my manuscript. And that was really the genesis of the book.
Can you tell us about the time frame covered in this memoir, Rearview Reflections? How does it span across the decades, and what significant events or changes do you highlight?
I looked at this material that I had that covered a period of more than 50 years. And one of the things I came to the conclusion about was that I needed to structure it in a way that would make sense and be digestible, really, for an audience that was reading it. I did go decade by decade, and I thought about the radical changes that had occurred in my life, or that I had been exposed to. And so for the first decade, I was thinking about feminism and how in the 1970s I was dramatically impacted by the feminist movement of that period. But moving on to the 80s, I was a freelance writer, and I was struggling to basically earn a living as a writer, and got involved with organizing both the Feminist Writers Guild and the National Writers Union for freelance writers. So that was an exposure to the labor movement from the context of being a writer. In the 90s, I had made a major shift from being a freelance journalist to working full-time. I now had 2 children. I began to realize I had to do more than get the kind of rates that freelance writers get. And I did go to work for the organization called Consumers Union. Most people know it as the magazine Consumer Reports, but it's actually owned by a nonprofit called Consumers Union, whose origins were from both the labor movement of the 1930s and the consumer movement, which was really an effort to form cooperatives in order to have purchasing power, and also to have better control and advocacy for the rights of consumers, to fight against the dangers of unsafe products, and to try to promote better, more efficient, and fair, or more fair, I should say, ways of getting financial services and insurance, all the things that we rely on today as consumers. So that was kind of a focus for the 1990s for me. From 2000 to 2010, I really had a very challenging period of family issues with my parents, gradual decline, and ultimately their deaths. And so I would say that was the major challenge for that period of my life, at the same time that I was dealing as a parent with the demands on parents as the world of the internet and social media had begun exploding. There was a lot happening in that decade from a personal standpoint for me. And then, of course, the era that most of us living today are familiar with, 2010 up until the current time, we've had some dramatic changes in everything from the first Black president of the United States, a movement for Black Lives Matter, at the same time as we had the Make America Great, what they consider revolution, to attempt to really go back to a period of the United States where, frankly, Black lives really didn't matter, and women didn't really matter, and a lot of things. So it's important to take a look, I think, at the kind of radical changes that society has been through, One of the things that in the course of editing my book, I came to realize was that I wanted my book to have some greater purpose than just me sharing my writing over a period of 50 years. And that purpose was to really explain why we need today to make radical changes because of climate change, and how important that is for the future for our children and our grandchildren. I had become a grandparent in the course of the last decade of the book, and that was really the thing that motivated me to do the work that was necessary to finish the book. And that is my Green Grandma call for climate action. It's not just a retrospective. It's a rear view look at radical changes, because we need to make radical changes in order to combat the kind of climate change that we're seeing. And we're seeing that change because we have become so reliant on fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels have led to a dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So that was really kind of the arc of the book over the decades, and how I came to the conclusion that climate change was really my motivator for writing the book.
And how does your current book differ from your previous work, which was called Unearthing the Ghosts, a Mystery Memoir?
Unearthing the Ghosts was a mystery memoir because I was trying to figure out a trauma that had occurred to me when I was a minor. I was 17 years old. At that time, my parents had really become concerned that I had turned from a very devout, easy to manage child into a questioning, resistant adolescent who was experiencing all of the changes that the 1960s brought to American society and global society, frankly. I was opposed to the Vietnam War. I became radicalized by thinking about how immoral I thought that war was. And at the same time, the marijuana culture was very prevalent, and I started smoking pot, and I started listening to lots of rock and roll, and including some of the what a quote unquote revolution calls for in some of the music that we were listening to in those years. So that book was really a look at what was going on in the society at that time, and why was it that my mother and my father decided that this meant that I was mentally ill, and sent me to a psychiatrist. And that psychiatrist, who experimented a lot with psychoactive drugs, why he decided that I was a schizophrenic, and put me on antipsychotic medications. At that time, the dosage that he was using was way in excess of what is used today for someone who is truly a serious schizophrenic. And I learned subsequently from many doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, that there was no way I had ever really been a schizophrenic, and that this doctor had really committed a form of malpractice. And as a result, I have frankly had to struggle for the rest of my life with that knowledge that that happened, and that my parents didn't believe that I was sane. And I developed a great deal of empathy for people, whether they are really mentally ill or whether they have been labeled that way and really are just perhaps ill or stressed for some other reason, that that being labeled as mentally ill, being labeled as a schizophrenic, has a terrible consequence to it in the way that people are treated and the way that we treat anyone who is labeled that way. So the book, Unearthing the Ghosts, was my effort to find out, how did that happen? Why did the doctor do what he did? Who was that doctor? Why did my parents make this assumption and just agree with the doctor who really, he diagnosed me and put me into a psychiatric ward without ever even seeing me, just based on a meeting with my mother and a look at a diary. How could that happen? And why did it happen? So it's a very different type of book than my new book. That book is really a classic coming of age experience with trauma and the recovery from that trauma. Whereas my current book is a look back after that initial recovery and all of the different things that have affected my life moving forward, both from larger social and political context to the personal aspects of changes in my own life, some of which have been also radical, like radical changes in the larger society.
What message or theme do you hope that readers take away from your new book, Rearview Reflections on Radical Change?
One of the main messages that I want people to come to is that we all need to do our part as individuals in any way that we can to try to stop the type of climate change that is occurring. And I hope that the messages from the previous radical changes that I discuss in the book are basically motivation and inspiration for how we can change. We can change our own individual behaviors. We can advocate for change that both our governmental leaders need to make, radical changes that the business community needs to make in order to stop producing greenhouse gases. And that's the primary message. But I also hope that this message is one that can be shared across the political divide. All of us have an interest and a stake in the future for children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews, grandnieces and grandnephews, whatever family that we are connected with, whatever tribe we consider ourselves to be a part of, all of us are affected by climate change. And we need to all address it as individuals, as members of our family, as members of the larger society groups that we're in. So I hope that this is also a message that cuts across divisions between us, and that we can come together, because the human family is in jeopardy. All living creatures on the earth are in jeopardy, and we need to do what we can to remedy that problem.
Linda, how did your experience as a journalist influence your writing?
One of the things you learn as a journalist is that you've got to meet deadlines and that there's urgency involved at a certain point. So that both helped me to set a deadline. I did use a program called The Right Practice, where I was determined that looking at 50 years of writing, I was going to, within a year, make sure that I had a first draft of the manuscript. So I think that journalism helped in that sense. And I would urge anyone who's setting out to write a book to set themselves a deadline where they're going to get their first draft done. And then after you're done with the first draft, you've got to set other deadlines. And if you ever want the book to see the light of day, there's a lot of process that's involved. There is both the process of editing, the process of showing it to other people, getting feedback from them, the process of potentially having a professional editor. If you're fortunate enough to get a literary agent who can shop your book around for you, that's great. But that's also a process. And there's a lot that goes into the work that authors do and that writers do in any genre that they write, in any type of books that they might write. It's a real challenge. So I would say deadlines, urgency, the reality that as a journalist, sometimes you write a piece and it gets cut to shred by an editor. So you want to always keep in mind that it's not just for you, it's for your readers. And you need to both structure and keep in mind in terms of the language that you use that you want it to be an enjoyable experience for your readers. I think those were the lessons from journalism.
What challenges did you face while writing your new book, and how did you overcome them?
The challenges were really emotionally looking again at sometimes things over the course of 50 plus years that were painful. So it is an emotional experience. It's a cathartic experience to write a memoir. And even many fiction authors are dealing with themes, experiences, sometimes characters and stories from their own lives, even if they're writing a fictional version. That's something that I think is one of the hardest things, is taking a clinical approach like a doctor would to a patient towards your own writing, and cutting, sometimes surgically, sometimes with a hacksaw, things that you have an emotional connection to, and yet you realize this is really not going to fly. It's not going to be clear to people. Those, I think, were the main challenges, was, that getting over the emotional attachment and trying to make it something that could have a broader appeal than just something to suit my own ego.
Could you share a memorable or impactful moment from your writing journey?
You know what? I don't know how to answer.
All right, Linda, and then how can readers connect with you and stay updated on your work?
One of the things that I realized with my book was calling for climate change in the book wasn't enough if I didn't give readers some way to do that. So I created a website that you can find through my name, lindamarywagner.com, or you can also find it through greengrandmas.org. And that both provides a lot of information about how to connect with the climate change and climate action movements, through organizations, through personal life changes that you can make to try to reduce your own carbon footprint. And then also every week I put a blog post up that really addresses some, recent thing that's happened in the climate news arena. And I make an effort to really focus as much as possible on solutions, even though sometimes the solutions may be, how do I manage if I end up in a drought or a flood zone or some other area where there are wildfires? What are the things that I need to know and that I need to do? So those are some of the goals of the website, and that's really the way that I hope to keep in touch with any audience that I have. And I welcome any input that I get back from that. There are ways to reach me through that website. In addition, down the road, I'm hoping that I'm going to come up with some good ways to do some children's books about the topic, and that some of my own grandchildren may enjoy those books as well.